So last week, I was up here and I shared a little bit about St. Nicholas and Santa Claus. And one of the things I said was that when I was a kid, I loved Santa Claus. And actually, the truth was, when I was a little kid, I loved Christmas. And it wasn't just when I was a little kid. Like, I love everything about Christmas now. I love Christmas decorations. I love Christmas music. I like Christmas presents. I like Christmas presents a lot. I like Christmas parties. I even like going Christmas shopping, which I know. It's hard. Yeah. I heard a manly grunt from the back of the room and like, you failed us. I like all that. And there's hardly anything about Christmas that I don't like. And for a long time, like when I would hear people say, you know what, I'm not into Christmas. I don't like Christmas. I didn't get how anyone could think that way or feel that way. Like, what's not to like about Christmas? There's just so much to look forward to and so much to enjoy and so much to get excited about. And then 2020 happened. And you know what? Like, even those of us who love Christmas most years find this year to be a little flat, a little melancholy. And for some of you, that's how Christmas has been most of the years that you've been here on this earth. There are a lot of traditions that we're missing out on, or a lot of traditions that we're having to adjust or wait on, and the things that we even do get to do don't always feel so bright. Maybe you're just exhausted right now. Like maybe you work in the medical field and you're just finding yourself tired. Maybe you work in retail and you just find yourself overwhelmed by what you're experiencing day to day in the store. Maybe your employer has had to cut your hours, and so the paychecks aren't looking like they normally would, and so Christmas just feels a little different because of that. Maybe you've experienced loss of a loved one this year or other years, and that's affected how you feel about this time of year. Maybe financial issues have actually been a recurring issue in your life, and so, man, Christmas, it feels like so much of it is about money. And so Christmas just shines this big old spotlight on something you feel like is a failure in your life. Whew. You know, that'll make the Christmas lights and the decorations and the presents and everything else just feel a little empty. Like it doesn't feel like the most wonderful time of the year. Sometimes it feels like the most difficult time of the year. For some of us, that's a new feeling. Some of us have felt that way for a long time. And I know people will say, oh, come on, it's Christmas. Like, you've got to get a little bit excited. But for some of us, there's just no laying aside how you feel. Because the things you faced, you just can't imagine celebrating Christmas the way other people do. The way we see it on TV, the way we see it in the movies. Christmas just can't be that way. But what if? What if all the hardship, all the difficulty, all the melancholy was precisely what Christmas was for? You know, the lead up to Christmas every year is always lights and music and sound and excitement. And that's great. Like I said, I love all that stuff. But what if the origin of Christmas, what if the place Christmas comes from isn't light? Rather, it's darkness. What if Christmas was made for the darkness and we can't actually experience the true depth of the meaning of Christmas unless we can find it in the darkness? I think that's precisely what we find when we lay aside kind of our pictures and our ideas of Christmas and we actually look here and we see just how Jesus came and how Christmas truly comes to us. So if you've got a Bible or you want to open another tab on your browser, go ahead and find Isaiah 9. Isaiah 9. So this is one of the prophecies about the birth of Jesus. And so this would have been written like 700 years before we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Jesus was born. And one particular verse from this passage is really famous, and you probably have it like nicely engraved on an ornament hanging on your tree, or maybe on like a wall hanging or something like that. And it is a great verse. But man, if we just jump straight to it, we're going to miss the words that the prophet had to say not just 700 years before Jesus was born, and not just for the night Jesus was born, but for us, the Sunday before Christmas in 2020. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through this kind of verse by verse, and we're just going to see what I want to say, the context for Christmas this morning. So, Isaiah 9, and we're going to start in verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. The people dwelling in darkness, the people living in the land of the shadow of death. That's how some of us feel. And we might wonder, well, okay, what's that all about? So we, valley of the shadow of death, right? We get that in Psalm 23, and so maybe we've got connections there. But what's Isaiah actually talking about here? Well, just a couple verses ahead of this in chapter 8, we see Isaiah is talking about people who are hungry and they have no food. Like they don't have what they need. People who have no purpose and no direction, so they are roaming the world searching for something, and they turn to other spiritual guides, and those spiritual guides just get them more lost than they were when they started. This is right at the end of chapter 8. They look at the earth and only see distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Distress, gloom, darkness. Whew. Some of us are well acquainted with those words right now. And some of us, it just sounds familiar because that's probably the description of the evening news on the channel guide right now. Distress, gloom, and darkness at 6, right? The people dwelling in darkness, the people walking in darkness, the people living in the land of shadow of death. They've seen light. You see, this story of Christmas doesn't begin with the light. It's not a grand processional, a celebration of music and hoopla and lights. Isaiah says, no, this moment starts in the middle of darkness. It starts in the midst of darkness to people who are dwelling in darkness and living in a land of shadow. The story of Christmas doesn't begin with bright lights. It begins with darkness. It begins in a time when there was no hope and the burdens are heavy. But then they see light. Christmas comes in the darkest times. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. Like, okay, the harvest. Here Isaiah starts talking about the harvest. Like, are there any farmers here this morning? I know the Krepses are watching online. So if you ever talk to a farmer, if you ever even just talk to someone who's got a good garden, like there is never a worthy harvest without some back-breaking struggle and sweat. You never just cast some seeds on the ground and then a month later, oh look, food, sustenance, provision. It takes work. It takes effort. It takes sweat. It takes struggle. Christmas, Jesus coming. He doesn't come as the honored guest at a party when people are already yucking it up and enjoying their drinks and their music. There's darkness. There's struggle. Christmas comes. Jesus comes when we're exhausted. Christmas comes when you can't go one step further. Verse 5. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood. I'm sorry, verse 4. Let's jump back up. I skipped one. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Okay, Midian's defeat, like what's that all about? Like, I don't know. When I read the Old Testament, and sometimes I read that, for as in the day of Midian's defeat, blah, 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 verse 5. Okay, here we go. Like, we're tempted to just kind of like scroll past that till the next thing that we get. But let's dig in here a little bit. So what is Midian? What are we talking about here? So we find the story about Midian, which Midian's an enemy of Israel. Midian's a land. We find it back in the book of Judges. And the whole thing is, Midian is this enemy of God's people. And Israel, God's people, they do that back-breaking work we talked about, that struggle to have a good harvest, to store up food for their families, put dinner on the table for their children. Then the Midianites, they just swarm in without having done any of that work, and they push God's people around, and they take it from them. They just take the harvest. Like, can you imagine how the Israelites felt during that time? I mean, okay, like the taking of the harvest is one thing, but all that work, all that desire to provide for your family to come up empty. Nothing to show for it. The Midianites, they crushed the spirit of Israel. Crushed the spirit of Israel. And that's been the story for some of us. For some of us, that's been the story of our lives, and for some of us, that's been the story of this year. Work and work and hard work, and we've made good decisions, and we've put in the effort, and then just something or someone or a historical worldwide event comes in and snatches it from us. Feels like we can't get ahead. It feels like we keep falling behind. I've said myself, it feels like there's no winning right now. It's just losing. But man, a day's coming. A day's coming when victory comes. A day's coming when we will celebrate the defeat of Midian. But it doesn't come at the beginning. Christmas comes when defeat, our defeat, seems certain. Verse 5. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. Well, okay, that's a little bit intense. So we get this picture of warriors, of soldiers taking their blood-soaked uniforms and their boots and chucking them into the fire. And war is this endless cycle. It was true then and it's true now. Nations go to war and fight, and innocent people end up, oftentimes, the crushed individuals in these battles. A day's coming when the cruelty of war will come to an end. The fighting between nations and the using of people, it'll be over. It'll be over. But on a personal level, like each day for many of us, feels like a battle all by itself. We battle with illness, we battle with addiction, with depression. We fight memories of past things, big and small, that still have hurt us and damaged us. And each day we get through feels like our boots are a little more worn, there's less tread to get through the next day, and our uniforms are just covered in the viscera of those battles. But friends, a day's coming. The day's coming when we'll take off that battle armor and we'll lay it aside, and those blood-soaked, battle-stained garments, you're going to toss them in the fire because you won't need them anymore. It doesn't come at the beginning. Christmas comes when you just can't fight anymore. The people living in the land of the shadow of death, the people dwelling in darkness see a light. Midian will be defeated, harvests will be restored, wars end. And it comes like this. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Like a child. A child. A child was not what the solution they were looking for. Like, couldn't it have been a warlord with a nice army, well-trained? Couldn't it have been a great politician to make effective speeches? Couldn't it have been an elite scientist who knew the right ways? Couldn't it have been a savvy businessman? Couldn't it be anyone who knew anything other than a child? But it was a child. It was a child in whom the fullness of God would dwell. It was a child on whom the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. A child who will be everything this broken world needs. A child who will be everything I need in my darkest and most broken times. A child who is not a band-aid on the world's wounds, a child that doesn't give me a pat on the back. No, it's a child who's going to set the wrongs right. It's a child who's going to destroy the darkness and light. It's this impossible child who's going to be born in this impossible way, in this impossible time to change everything. Christmas comes at the most unlikely times and in the most unlikely ways. Friends, I know it's so easy for us when we consider the things that we've felt and experienced, the hardships that we bear this year and in years past. And we think, there isn't going to be a holly jolly Christmas in this home this year. I'll never be able to celebrate Christmas that way. I've lost too much. The burden is too heavy. It simply isn't possible. But don't you see, that's the beauty of Christmas. When the days are their darkness, when we're defeated, when we can't go one step further and we can't fight anymore, Jesus shows up. God in the flesh arrives on the scene, and it dawns on us like, it's still Christmas. It might be 2020. It might be the hardest times for us. But it's still Christmas. And Jesus doesn't just wave a magical wand to make it go away. No, all that hardship, all that struggle finds its meaning in him and his arrival. Jesus' arrival says that the difficult times we're living in had a purpose, and they're coming to an end. God says they must end. The arrival of Jesus puts the evil forces of this world on notice and says, the clock's ticking, your time's almost over. The time for you to hurt, the time for you to steal, the time for you to destroy is coming to an end. That's why we got to turn on the lights at Christmas. That's why we got to celebrate. That's why we've got to summon this joy from the depths of our spirit. See, for too long, we've relied on things like presents and decorations and hoopla to manufacture some giddiness in us. And so when we come to Christmas and say, I'm just not feeling it this year, what we're really saying is that doesn't manufacture anything in me. But Christmas is not about manufacturing anything. It's about our spirit that has been touched by the Holy Spirit, summoning the joy that was always there. Always there. And so that when we summon that joy and reach into that part of our heart, Jesus casts away the shadows that would cripple our hearts and cripple our minds. Today, it comes to an end. And because of that, we turn on the Christmas lights. Because of that, we decorate. Because of that, we give to one another. Because of that, we summon that true and lasting joy that is not shaken, that cannot be blotted out, that cannot be pushed away. Friends, if your Christmas is just feeling melancholy and flat this year, if you've always struggled with Christmas, if it's always felt like it could never be what it should be, then I'm telling you today, summon that joy that doesn't come from these things, these decorations, this joy that doesn't come from these songs, this joy that doesn't come from anything outside, but rather comes from the Spirit of Jesus living inside us. It comes from this knowledge that we're children of the King. who were bought with a price. That's joy that lasts. Because of that, because we've seen the light of Jesus, we turn on the lights, we sing loudly, and we celebrate. Because even in our darkest of times, even when we can't go one step further, even when we can't fight anymore, even when all we see is darkness, it's still Christmas. Because Christmas was made for the darkness. Let's pray. Father, I would pray right now that for any of us who have felt that shadow over our hearts and minds, the shadow that comes from looking, I want to say, into the soul of this broken world, may your light cast it away. We have been people who have dwelt in darkness. We've eaten it up sometimes. God, forgive us. Turn our eyes to you. Push the shadows of this world away from our hearts. Pull back the shade that's over our minds. And may the light that you've placed inside us from the moment we said yes to you, Jesus, burst forth. So that when we turn to those decorations, they're not there to make us happy. They're there because we overflow with joy. Joy in our hearts from you. Oh God, remind us. Remind us why we celebrate. Remind us why we give to one another. Remind us why, in the middle of darkness, we turn on 1,000 little lights. It's still Christmas. Nothing about this year will change that. You've still come. And nothing will crush my joy.